let's not carry on plans. The point is that you're here and you can give your presentation. He came all the way from Iran to us.
Good morning. On behalf of Dr. Alireza Omidbakhsh and myself, we want to thank you for your time. In the postmodern times, afflicted with what Edward Said calls the rhetoric of blame, and the perception of ever smaller groups as different to other such groups to an extent that any sincere communication between them is impossible, the need for a ray of light out of this deadness seems all the more urgent. We therefore have chosen the 2015 debut novel by the Vietnamese-American writer Nguyen, The Sympathizer, and we also use concepts from Roger Gissel's theory of communication and criticism proposed in Literature Communication, published in 2000, to discuss the two notions of exoticism and divided self, with an eye to the postmodern situation mentioned. With regards to exoticism, we are concerned with the feelings that are induced in a person when encountering someone ostensibly from a considerably different background, an exotic person. These feelings can be broadly categorized as either admiration or fear, and as well as the spectrum between these two and the subsequent feelings such as anger, hatred, ignoring, or being enamored, which result from these initial responses to the unknown. Exoticism, therefore, can act as a barrier in communicational situations by preventing one or both parties from seeing the other person as he or she is, as the effects of exoticism cloud their vision. As for the notion of the divided self, we mean the detection of inconsistencies, contradictions, or oppositions in oneself. Although not everybody is aware of this in themselves, and the extent of the divisions can vary from person to person, having a centered, coherent self has been challenged for many years now, and sensing a divided self corresponding with Roger Gissel's notion of the protean self can be seen as a common experience, therefore one of the points which help overcoming the undesired consequences of exoticism, as I will talk about later. The Sympathizer tells the story of an unnamed Vietnamese communist undercover agent in the midst of the Vietnamese refugees in the USA right after the Vietnam War. He escapes with his refugees upon his handler's orders to keep eye on any possible future plans of subversion by a former general of the Republic of Vietnam, who he works for as a personal aide. He is a man of two minds, and here the title finds its other meaning. The first, a proponent of the communist North Vietnam, and the second, a man who is able to see any issue from both sides, therefore a sympathizer. After portraying his life in exile to include the assassination of two supposedly other communist sympathizers, in which he inadvertently had an emphatic role and his participation in the making of a Hollywood movie on the Vietnam War, he finally goes back with a handful of other soldiers in a secret subversive mission unit to Vietnam. He has his personal reasons for accompanying these men. He wants to protect one of the two friends of his, with whom he has made a blood pact in scenes to be friends with and to protect each other in life, no matter the circumstances. The other friend, Man, the name of the other friend is Man, similar to him, is a communist undercover agent who has stayed in Vietnam after the war and has been a part of the new government. They are captured in their attempt to infiltrate Vietnam, and he gets subject to re-education by his comrades as they see him contaminated for too long with Western ideology. The story is told for the most part of the novel in the form of his written confession to the commandant in charge of his re-education. During this re-education, the protagonist finds that his friend and handler Man is the commissar in charge of the re-educational torture. The protagonist is then tortured by Man in his attempt to save his life and help him understand the situation. The torture ends when Man is satisfied by his answer to the question, what is more precious than independence and freedom? The answer being nothing, meaning both, and here it again has two meanings. Meaning both that nothing is more precious than independence and freedom, and that revolutions and government systems ultimately restrict others' freedom and independence in the name of greater good, therefore rendering their own goals worthless. And hence nothing is more precious than independence and freedom. He is then released from the camp alongside their other friend Ban, and they are set to escape the country on a boat arranged for by man. The protagonist is a bastard. He is of mixed parentage, his mother Vietnamese and his father French priest. This status of being a bastard, or the love child as his mother calls it, makes the effects of being regarded as exotic acuter in this case. One reason for the effects of exoticism inducing feelings of admiration or fear or mixture of both is the unitary context assumption. According to Roger Pistel in literature as communication, the unitary context assumption is the assumption that the context given at the outset of communication can be identical for the two or more people involved, and involves an historical idealization that is typical of much 20th century research in the humanities. In reality, though, the unitary context assumption can never hold, even if it is in minute details, the life experience and sociocultural settings of the two communicants to always have their discrepancies. However, the person who has the unitary context assumption in mind, when coming across a person perceived as exotic and conspicuously from different contexts, feels a shock in the annulment of this assumption. Hence, the feelings of admiration or fear based on what stereotypes he has in mind of the other person's context. One possible effect of this resort to stereotypes is to expect from the person perceived as exotic only those stereotypical behaviors. Ms. Mori, a character in the novel, an American of Japanese heritage, describes this in talking to the protagonist about the behavior of white people towards her. They think I'm a dainty little China doll with bound feet, a geisha who's ready to please. But I don't talk enough for them to love me. Like this, I don't talk the right way. I can't put on the whole sukiyaki and sayonara show they love the chopsticks in the fair kind of mumbo jumbo. All that's to the one inch. Like every white man who comes along is William Holden or Marlon Brando, even if he looks like Mickey Rooney. The protagonist being a bastard is also affected by exoticism. In childhood, he is picked on by his fellow schoolmates for being a bastard, symbolically emphasizing his status as exotic, which in an occasion of engaging in a fight with them leads to his tight bond and marriage to friends. He is also treated differently by his mother's relatives, and for instance, he sees nothing or half the other children during the New Year holidays. He retells the experience in his confession in these words. My mother was native, my father was foreign, and strangers and acquaintances had enjoyed reminding me of this ever since my childhood, spitting on me and calling me bastard, although sometimes for variety they called me bastard before they spit on me. Accordingly, in adulthood he is still harassed by others, as in the encounter with 3 young Vietnamese Marines in the night of his departure alongside Bond, the general, and the general's relatives and employees from Vietnam. One of the Marines says, "What are you? I'll tell you what you are, bastard." Even the general, who, when choosing him to be his aide, tells him the only thing I'm interested in is how good you are at what you do, even if the things I ask you to do may not be so good. And later tells Claude, the CIA agent, I am not a racist, Claude. I treat all my men the same, no matter their origins, like our young friend, the protagonist here. Upon learning that the protagonist has tried to seduce his daughter, betrays the vestiges of his prejudices. He decides to send the protagonist on the secret subversive mission to Vietnam, telling him upon his departure that I wanted you here by my side. I would never have let you go except for this. How could you ever believe we would allow our daughter to be someone of your kind? You are a fine young man, but you are also, in case you have not noticed, a bastard. While for the protagonist fellow Vietnamese, the accidental traits, whether in his education or his parentage, make him exotic. For the American, it is his Oriental roots. However, in encountering the Vietnamese, the Americans as hegemonic superiors, in the words of the protagonist joking about the American side, neither look through nor down with these newcomers. They simply look over them. This is the case for most of the encounters of the protagonists and Americans. Claude, the CIA agent, for instance, chooses him amidst the occupants of a refugee barge in 1954 because the protagonist was a precocious 9-year-old who had already learned a decent amount of English taught to him by pioneering American missionary. He sees in the protagonist a shedding of the Oriental traits and the potential of firmly in the American ideals, ironic when viewed in the light of the protagonist being the communist sleeper. Therefore, Clark sees him free for receiving a training managed by CIA for the cause of the Republic of Vietnam and defeating communism. Dr. Ted, another character, the author of a book titled Asian Communism and the Oriental Mode of Destruction, likewise treats the protagonist as an Oriental who has successfully gotten rid of that part of himself and has become an Occidental. The dreamer of the American dream. He has written in his book that the young Vietnamese who are enamored of America hold the key to South Vietnam's freedom. They have tasted the Coca-Cola as it were and discovered it to be sweet. Cognizant of our American imperfections, they are nevertheless hopeful about our sincerity and our goodwill in working on those flaws. It is these young men we must cultivate. It is about his encounter with Dr. Ted, in which the protagonist is sitting between, along with the general, congressman, and several others, that the protagonist writes that a remark about famine in Vietnam during the Japanese occupation damages the pleasant atmosphere of the meal because the spiritual teleportation unsettled most people who, if they thought of others at all, preferred to think that others were just like them or could be just like them. Therefore, the protagonist, having his own agenda, tries to alleviate the gloominess by saying that tragedy was a long time ago. To tell you the truth, most of our countrymen here are less focused on the past than they are on becoming Americans. In this company, the congressman's behavior is also a manifestation of seeing not only the protagonist, but the whole society of the Vietnamese refugees as zealous proponents of the American beliefs. However, it is in the protagonist's encounter with the author, a famed Hollywood director directing a movie about the Vietnamese War, that we see the most striking instance of the effects exoticism can have on impeding a true act of communication. The author, believing that he knows the Vietnamese, says, "I researched your country, my friend. I read Joseph Buttinger and Francis Fitzgerald. Have you read Joseph Buttinger and Francis Fitzgerald? He is the foremost historian in a little part of the world, and she won the Pulitzer Prize. She dissected your psychology. I think I know something about you people." But the protagonist tells him that you didn't even get the screams right. And when the author objects that the screams are universal, he tells him that if he strangles the author with a telephone cord, his attempted screams and his personal assistant's screams will be very different. In this way, the protagonist challenges the author's military context assumption. However, despite the author employing him to help with getting the details of the movie right, the final movie still turns out to be as the author envisaged it in the first place, and the protagonist's role in its making only a sham measure taken to make it superficially more authentic. The one-sided narration telling the goal of the protagonist's work, having the first part where the losers would write history instead of the victors, courtesy of the most efficient propaganda machine ever created, Hollywood. And actually, the allusion is to Apocalypse Now in the note. Even the protagonist's name is omitted from the credits of the movie. In order to enter the discussion of the second notion studied in this presentation, the divide itself, we'll start with an example from the book which portrays an interrelation of the effects of exoticism and the divide itself. Professor Hammer, the protagonist's thesis supervisor, his first visit to America, and the sponsor who helped him get out of the refugee camp and gave him a job in the university. In his second, asked the protagonist to write a chart with his Occidental and Oriental traits in 2 columns. This chart, the protagonist, in order to humor the professor, feels in much the same way that Edward Said talks about the Occidentals as stereotypical view of the Orient in Orientalism. Professor Hammer then sits him down and talks about the division in the protagonist's identity. He talks in a way that seems like he recognizes this division and is optimistic that people like the protagonist will be the future of America and an embodiment of the symbiosis of the Orient and the Occident. However, when the protagonist asks him, would it make any difference if I told you I was actually Eurasian and Eurasian, he tells no, dear boy, absolutely not. Later at the dinner in the professor's house, he talks about America as a supreme force of freedom and talks in a way that seems to show his utter disposition for seeing America as a source of the, quote, the best of what was taught and said. This portrays him not only as affected by the military context assumption, therefore not distinguishing between Europe, a group of different countries notwithstanding the similarity of America, but also encouraging the protagonist implicitly to suppress his Oriental traits for the benefit of his Occidental ones. In his psyche, the Orient is still the exotic and the Occident the familiar, the universal. This, albeit the other way around, is what the commandant too asks the protagonist to do. Discussing his confession with him, he tells him, "You would be better off if you only saw things from one side. The only cure for being a bastard is to take a side." From the outset of the novel, it is apparent that the protagonist is well aware of his status as a bastard, a symbol of his two-mindedness, his divided self. However, he has not come to terms with it. He doesn't know whether it's a talent or a hazard. He writes, "After all, a talent is something you use, not something that uses. The talent you cannot not use, the talent that possesses you, that is a hazard." In his confession, he frequently uses we when talking about the situation of the Southern Vietnamese. In this regard, he writes to the commandant in his confession, "You have asked me what I am, what I mean when I say we or us. And in those moments when I identified with the Southern soldiers and evacuees on whom I was sent to spy, should I not refer to those people, my enemies, as them? I confess that after having spent almost my whole life in the company, I cannot help but sympathize with them, as I do with many others." So what to do? This awareness of his divided self is evident throughout the novel, but at the beginning of chapter 21, after being subject for a while to a final torturing of his education, the point of view changes to the third person. He is disembodied. He has distanced himself from himself. He is viewing himself as if from above. This becomes a necessary step for his final resolution. Roger Bissell talks about self-discovery through self-alienation as a result of engaging in a sincere communicational situation. He writes that people whose life experience takes place within different contexts can actually move closer together. The contextual disparity is starting to diminish as they make the effort to understand each other. Even if they do not end up in complete agreement, there is a sense in which this agreement itself entails a kind of agreement. They cannot truly dissent from each other's views until they have tried them out in their own imagination. When their empathizing does result in a greater or lesser degree of more permanent personal change, communication would have been a process of self-alienation that results in self-discovery, perhaps ultimately making for co-adaptive changes to their entire milieu. This is what happens to the protagonist of the communicational situation with his own divided self, which Roger Bissell calls the protean self and believes is common in human beings. As a result of this first step of self-elimination, the protagonist gets to a new sense of himself and starts to use we towards the end of the novel in order to refer to himself. He has come to a resolution with regards to his divided self. This does not mean that there will be a consensus between these different selves. It just means that he is acknowledging them, and henceforth there will be a conscious dialogue between these different selves. The protean self or the divided self not only means we can sense different selves in ourselves simultaneously and in the course of our lives, but also facilitates our power of imagining alternative contexts which we come across. In imaginatively projecting ourselves into a different context, we are able to empathize with the other. This, however, should not be mistaken for sympathy. And the difference being that in empathizing, we are not going to seek to outlive the other. Talking about getting past the barrier exoticism poses to sincere communication, we do not mean to imply that we are all the same in terms of context, thoughts, behaviors, in other words, in our social individuality. In the words of Roger Bissell talking about the mediation, he proposes this will not be a matter of arbitrary social differences, for these are both inevitable and potentially fruitful. The point is rather to prevent them from becoming over-dramatized. Communication, understanding, and reasonable settings will be taken as real possibilities, and in practice, there may even come to pass a greater or lesser amount of agreement or reciprocal influence. This reasonable disagreement, compared to a general consensus, is a much more realistic goal to aim for. The exotic otherness is not to be overlooked, as the otherness of the less conspicuously exotic in communicational situations should not be ignored. The aim of a communicational act is not to reach perfect agreement, exactly because as we are different in our context, the achievement of such a flawless agreement seems like a chimera. Therefore, what we are proposing is to try to get past the unnecessary obstacle of the communication that the exoticism poses, not to see the other as the same. Exoticism and regarding the other as exotic, as we have talked about, can happen perhaps a less apparent way regarding one's divided self too. There are certain aspects of ourselves that we regard as unacceptable because they seem unknown, undesirable, repugnant, objectionable, etc. to us. And because we want to hold the ideal of perfect inconsistency in ourselves. However, trying to suppress our different selves is not productive as the different selves entering the dialogue is. Just like the protagonist of the sympathizer, we may not reach a perfect harmony and consistency between our different selves, but we can surely communicate better with ourselves and consequently with others who, to a more or less degree, are also divided into different selves. We, after all, as self-beliefs, are all social individuals. We are formed by our sociocultural settings, but have some autonomy left as individuals to enter into a dialogue with those formative forces and to enter into a process of co-adaptation which not only changes us, but has the potential to change those broader forces. We share with each other what some call sustainedness, that is difference. And by acknowledging this, we acknowledge the commonness in the exotic as well. It is in this way and in a productive fashion that we, like the protagonist of the sympathizer, can say we will live and can look with optimism to the potential of new harmonies. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, I would like to ask